The views and opinions of this broadcast do not reflect the views and opinions of Armed Media, New Productions and its affiliates. Enjoy the show.
I'm your darkest dream. They call me devil. My heart is empty. They call me devil, and you should be afraid.
It's an incredibly little-known atrocity. The vast majority of people have got no idea that it ever happened, in spite of it being one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. And given the history of this country, that's really saying something. In 1921, Greenwood, Oklahoma was a prosperous community. In fact, it was the wealthiest black community in the United States. It was known as the Black Wall Street. But on Memorial Day weekend that year, Greenwood's prosperity, in fact, Greenwood itself, came to an awful, abrupt end. Greenwood was populated exclusively by African Americans, many of whom were very prosperous and ran successful businesses. Because of Jim Crow laws, Greenwood's residents weren't able to shop at white-owned businesses in Tulsa. Now, 100 years ago, Greenwood had its own hospital, many doctors, including a nationally renowned surgeon, a library, schools, hotels, theaters, and a whole lot more. At the time, Tulsa was a hotbed of the biting, bitter racism that plagued the United States. Between 1882 and 1968, there were almost 5,000 known lynchings spread across more than 40 states. Experts agree that there were undoubtedly more, maybe thousands more. Almost 3/4 of the people who were lynched were African American. Think about what's involved in this. Lynching was murder carried out by a mob, and often with the cooperation of law enforcement. If law enforcement didn't actively participate, and there were times the law couldn't prevent a mob from doing what it wanted to do, law enforcement officers often refused to try to prevent the murder and were complicit in what went on. Huge crowds would come out to watch lynchings. Now, these weren't people coming to witness a public execution that had been ordered by a court of law. They were coming to watch mob justice. They were coming to witness a murder. Photographs of lynching victims would frequently be taken and then turned into postcards, which would be sent around the country. There were times that the protagonists of or witnesses to lynchings would cut off the fingers and so forth of lynching victims and keep them as souvenirs. So we're asking the question, what kind of person do you have to be capable of that? Now, first, some background to the Tulsa race riot, or the Greenwood massacre as it's often called. Before it had taken place, a 19-year-old white man, Roy Belton, admitted to having murdered a taxi driver. An angry mob seized him from the place where he was being held, took him a few miles out of town, and lynched him. What were law enforcement officials doing? They were there keeping the peace and diverting or directing the traffic. Up until this time, 20 African Americans had been lynched in the state of Oklahoma, but never in Tulsa. Well, now, black Tulsans realized or figured that if the white population was prepared to lynch a white man, it wouldn't be long before they lynched a black man. And sooner rather than later, their fears were realized. On May the 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoeshine boy named Dick Rowland entered the elevator of the Drexel building here at 319 South Main Street in Tulsa. Why was he in the elevator in the Drexel building? Well, he wanted to use the bathroom. And as a black man, he couldn't use the bathrooms that were used by the white population. And there was a colored bathroom on the top floor of the Drexel building. Now, exactly what happened inside that elevator isn't known, but it seemed that as the elevator began to move, it lurched, causing the elevator operator, a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page, to trip and fall forward. It might be that Dick Rowland tripped and fell forward. But whatever happened, in that moment, young Sarah Page let out a shout of surprise. And that shout of surprise ended up being a young man's death sentence. Dick Rowland knew that that scream was likely his death sentence. He ran out of the Drexel building as fast as he could, hoping that no one would see him. But somebody did see him. They heard a white girl scream and saw a young black man running. Now, in this case, 2 and 2 did not equal 4. But this was Tulsa in 1921. It wasn't long and he'd been arrested and locked up in the Tulsa County Courthouse. And shortly after that, a white mob arrived, demanding justice. They wanted Dick Rowland lynched. Sarah Page said repeatedly that Rowland had not harmed her. She wasn't hurt, her clothes weren't ruffled, but the police insisted that this was a case of attempted rape. She refused to sign a statement saying that that was so. But there was no way the facts were going to get in the way of an opportunity to put a young black man in his place. His place being, in this case, the end of a rope. Now, there was absolutely no basis in fact for what the mob was claiming and demanding. But here you had people you would assume were otherwise law-abiding and responsible, demanding the death of an innocent young man simply because of the hatred that existed in their heart. Now, there was no lack of things fanning those flames. It's said that more than 3,000 people in Tulsa at the time were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And there was a white-owned newspaper at the time, the Tulsa Tribune, that ran a number of editorials that were overtly racist. One headline said, "A Negro assaults a white girl." After Rowland's arrest, the Tribune's front page screamed, "To lynch Negro tonight." But a large number of Greenwood men decided they were not going to let that happen. They knew the shoeshine boy had done nothing wrong, and they weren't about to sit by while yet another innocent young black man was executed by a mob for a crime he didn't commit. So that group of men, among them World War I veterans who had served their country, armed, came down here, the site of the courthouse at that time, and they confronted that white mob of more than 2,000. That mob had massed right here in this very area. In the tension that followed, a shot was fired. And it was all on. What followed was mayhem. White Tulsans who didn't have guns stole guns and ammunition from gun shops or hardware stores, and they headed for Greenwood. Greenwood, a symbol of black progress, was burned to the ground completely. More than 20 black churches, a hospital, a funeral home, a school, a theater, doctors' and lawyers' offices, hotels, grocery stores, restaurants, and hundreds of homes, more than 1,000 structures, were all completely destroyed. Homes were looted. Anything that could be taken was taken. In years following, black residents who came back to the area knew that those possessions that they had left behind were now in white-owned homes and businesses. Now, if that was all, that would be bad enough. But the human toll was much higher. 300 people were killed, murdered, slaughtered, for no other reason than the color of their skin. If you were black, you were a target, and there was no shortage of people willing to take aim. In 1921, the same year as the Black Wall Street was destroyed by a white mob and 300 people were murdered, 2 Italian-American immigrants were convicted of robbery and murder. The crime took place in Braintree, Massachusetts, and Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were convicted of the crime. There was an uproar. Academics weighed in. People protested that the 2 were innocent. Writers and artists pleaded that the courts would reconsider. Even Albert Einstein signed a petition. Workers went on strike. After the 2 men were executed, 200,000 people came out to watch the funeral procession. This was a big, big deal, because there were those who believed, rightly or wrongly, that a miscarriage of justice was being carried out. But 1,400 miles away, at right around the same time, 300 people were murdered in cold blood, and the silence was deafening. So what has to take place in a human heart to make it possible for somebody to go there? Racism, you might say. Okay, but not every racist takes a gun and shoots somebody dead and then burns down their home or their town. Mob mentality. Okay, but people on that day knew the difference between right and wrong. There were many white people who sheltered and protected African Americans from the mob and saved their lives. People knew better. Reporting on the aftermath of the destruction of Greenwood, the Tulsa Tribune wrote this about black residents returning to what was left of their homes. As they passed the city's most traveled streets, they held both hands high above their heads, their hats in one hand, a token of their submission to the white man's authority. They will not return to the homes they had on Tuesday afternoon, but to heaps of ashes, the angry white man's reprisal for the wrong inflicted on them by the inferior race.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. Would you mind, first of all, telling me your full name and how it's spelled to make sure I have it right?
Eldoris. Eldoris. That's all together.
Eldoris.
Mae. Mae. Then McCondishi. McCon.
N is in North?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
CONDICHIE.
And how old are you?
88.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. Okay.
You don't look nervous.
Mm-mm. And have you lived in Tulsa all your life?
Well, since I was 4.
Mm-hmm. And, all right, and so you were how old at the time of the riot?
9 years old.
What did your family do?
What
did your family do for a living?
Oh, they were just common workers. My mother worked out, and my father did work at, it was a Kennedy's golf course then, and that's where he used to work. And years ago, they had to do the greens, and he was out there on the field. Mm-hmm. He used to call them dragging the greens to keep them so they could play golf. Mm-hmm. And my mother did housework.
Did you live in or near the Greenwood area?
No, Greenwood area.
Uh-huh.
Oh yes.
Okay. Where'd you live in relation to the business district?
I live right. Well, almost in this area. My house is over the track down Pine. You don't know where but anyway, Pine is the main street here, mm-hmm. And we were right over the track on Iroquois, mm-hmm. And that's the first little street. And my house might have been kind of even with this one over on the other side of the track.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you remember of the day of the riot? Do you remember what you were doing that day?
Yes. The day of the riot, we were running. We were, the people, my mother, when I was awakened by my mother, I was real frightened because she told me what was happening, and I couldn't imagine that. I just said to her, I just got up and was real afraid. And she says, we have to go out, get out. She says, the white people are killing the colored people. And I just felt that I could see them just lining us up, just going down the line too. But anyway, it wasn't that bad, but we had, the Million Valley track was just lined with people going north. Mm-hmm. And some were in the head rags, old gowns, because they didn't have any time to get dressed to get out. Even some women left their shoes and was just walking down the track with no shoes on. And it was the crowd was just the whole breadth of the railroad track, on the sides and down the middle. And they were all going north because they couldn't go south. And so we went right over the track off Pine was a small chicken coop. And a lot of people went in there because the bullets were just raining down over us. The airplanes was up, just raining down the bullets. And I could see them, and I heard them, and I was so frightened, I pulled away from my parents and ran into this chicken coop with all the other people. And I got into the corner of that, just scared as I could be. But my father came in there, and I had to leave out with him so I could stay with my family. So that was it. And I don't know, some little town going north on the Million Valley track. There was a farmer there, very nice. He was white, and he said, as many of you people can come into our to get into this house, because he'd had two houses. The first one he lived in, and he had built another one. He says, as many of you can come in and stay as long, until. Mm-hmm. So we stayed there overnight.
Excuse me, where was that?
This was, I can't remember the town, but we went to Pawhuska from there. Walking. Still going north. The next morning, I know we didn't walk, but I can't remember how. Mm-hmm. My mother, my brother, and myself got to Pawhuska. But we went there and stayed for 2 or 3 days until the all-clear sound was made here. And so we came back home.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember, one of the things we've been talking about a lot is the role of authority figures in the riot, that it wasn't just hoodlums and ruffians, but some of the... do you remember at the age of 9 what the role of authority figures seemed to be?
The authority figures, they were the men who, the businessmen, is that what you mean?
Business leaders
of Tulsa, yes, and Greenwood. Greenwood was just our street, our town. All the Negroes just had access to Greenwood. Our businesses were there. We had our doctors, our lawyers, our undertakers. All of the businessmen were down on Greenwood, just say from Cameron on back to Archer, but it was further than that. Some was up, and in our schools, Booker T. Washington was the high school, and we had a school, Dunbar was a grade school, and it was down on Eastern, a little 2-story red brick, Dunbar, and they were all blown up. Churches all over in that area, from say Eastern on down. It seemed like the teachers who lived on Detroit, up the hill, their homes were just blown apart. And so the better business of the business people who really made the town what it was. And of course, my parents helped too, but they was in a small area. But it was just, that was it.
So what time did your mother wake you up? Was it at night?
No, it was in the morning. I didn't tell this before, but I had been staying with my cousin about 2 doors down from our house. I had been sleeping down there at night, and I don't remember why now, but I would go home in the morning. So the evening of the riot, I went down there, and I said to my cousin, I says, I'm going home, and I'll be back in a few minutes. I did not get back. I went home and went to sleep, and I didn't know anything until my mother was waking me the next morning.
So she woke you up in the morning, and people had been rioting all night long.
Yeah, people had, and the track was just full of people, and all I could see was black rolling smoke down south and the people going north.
And when she woke you up and she said that the white people are killing the colored people, your first reaction was to envision it very clearly, not to say why. Did that reflect what those times were like? Did it surprise you that such a thing would happen?
No, I guess I was more too afraid to be surprised. I guess I'll put it that way, because I woke up just ready to run, and it was hard for them to keep me at that age. I knew I should have stayed with my parents, but just trying to get out of the way.
But in those days, I mean, did it seem perfectly possible that such a thing could happen sooner or later, or was it just, I mean, would it have been as strange if the birds came down from the trees and attacked you?
At 9 years old, I had no thoughts of that, because of anything could happen like that. We were just all out here peacefully living, and downtown seemed to be, but it just seemed to happen overnight downtown. And I didn't know until I was at the meeting that the race riot really started at night, but we had the first day of June 1921. And that's when we were all involved. We know we woke up running. And we couldn't go back south at all. The people out on that end, and I guess say downtown from maybe Independence on out north.
And what do you remember of the airplanes? You said the bullets were raining down from above. Tell me what you remember of that.
I just remember seeing them up there and seeing the bullets, hearing them as they drop, and seeing some of them.
Do you remember seeing white policemen or any sort of white people in uniform, or anyone trying to control things at all?
No. Everybody was fighting, and the Negroes were on the run until it was all, peace was declared, and then.
And you knew that because of the all clear siren?
No. We didn't hear a siren. We were in Pahuska, but we got the word that it was all clear. And then we did have curfew when I got back, and the National Guard was here to guard us for a while.
What did it look like when you came back? On Greenwood, the deep Greenwood. It was just a sound of this bricks, stones, buildings blown up. Just the war-torn place. And our pastor, the first pastor we had, he died not too long after the riot. And Jackson had his undertaker, his building was all just blown apart too, because he was down there on Greenwood, and he had just a little room, maybe from this plastic over here to the wall, and not this long back from here back, and he had to take the pastor's body in. And I remember my mother taking my brother and me down to see our pastor. And we just had to step over stones and bricks to get in the little door. And because his casket took up the whole wall, like this. And I remember standing in the door, just looking, to see him. And that's what it was. We didn't have any place else to go or take him. And Jackson's undertaker then. We still have Jax, but he's gone, and his son and wife are in there. What happened to the pastor? How did he die?
Well, they were at church one night after the riot, and they said he got up. Of course, I didn't go. They said he opened the service, sang a song, prayed and sang a song, and he just sat down and gave his Bible to another minister, another person, and just went over, just suddenly.
This was just a couple of days after the riot?
Well, I don't know. No, it was a little longer than that, but nothing had gotten back in place at the time.
Mm-hmm. Did your family consider staying away from Tulsa after that?
No.
How come?
Where we were, we weren't, we didn't lose anything where we were, and so that was just home.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't consider moving any place.
How did your family react? What kinds of conversations did you have in your family? Or
none at all, because
really?
If they were talking about it, we knew about it. I mean, I knew about it, and naturally, being a child, we were just children who were then we just, playing how older people sit around and talk, and we were in it, so we knew about it, but they were just merely talking about it.
And did your parents try to explain it in any way or make any sense of it? Did you ask?
No, I didn't.
How come?
I didn't ask because I felt that they didn't have to tell me what I saw and what I was in and the experience I went through. Just being a child all by myself, I just didn't have to ask them because whatever they said was right. I knew they were right because I was right there in it.
16-year-old junior. She was getting ready for the end of school at Booker T. Washington High School. And like other girls, she was probably getting ready for the prom. In 1923, she would marry Samuel Malone Jackson, who owned Jackson's Funeral Home. He was one of the most prominent business people in the Greenwood and Archer area. His funeral home was at 615 East Archer, 617 East Archer, which crosses Greenwood. So she's going to be talking about her own personal experiences and also about Samuel Jackson and the riot. Mrs. Jackson, thank you so much for sharing with us today. First tell me about your experiences, you and your mother, and how you had to flee your home and where you went and how that riot affected you. Then tell me about what it did to your future husband's funeral home.
Now, the night of the riot, we were sitting out in our yard, and the people started coming through the gate, just running through, going out the back. So they came so fast, my mother finally asked them where were they going. And they said they were having a riot over the hill, which was known then as the Brickyard Hill. We lived north of that. And they were just running, didn't know where they were going. And must have been about 8 o'clock in the morning, we persuaded Mama to let us go and get with the crowd. We didn't know where we were going. And when we got to Pine and Greenwood, the Home Guard had come from Oklahoma City. And they stopped us there. And they marched us from there down Pine to Cincinnati, from Cincinnati and Pine down to where the
Mohawk?
No, downtown on Brady. What is that?
Oh, the convention?
Convention Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got to the convention hall, they searched us before they would let us go in. And my mother had picked up my oldest brother's service revolver before we left home and had it in a little satchel. And they wanted to see it. And she said, I don't have anything in here but some important papers. So one of them said, well, old dogs have new tricks like young ones. And they searched and took the pistol and gave her the bag back. So we went in and found us a seat. And we sat there until I guess must have been about 4 o'clock in the evening when a white family my mother worked for had been there twice to ask about us. because she had given her name. And we didn't ever answer. So when they finally turned to solution, said, if you have a home that you think you might go to, you may be excused. So we walked from the convention hall to 1145 North Denver, where she had food prepared for us. And when we left, she said, well, Betty, you can go home. And if you don't have a home, said, you come back and we'll put some cots up in the basement for you. But we had some real poor white neighbors who lived across the street. And every time the firebugs would come to set the fire to our house, these white folks would come over there and put it out. That's how we happened to have a home after the riot. And then I don't know how they got these little cards printed so fast, but everybody had a little ID card. School children and all told what you did, and you had to have that little ID wherever you went. I kept mine for a long time and eventually got rid of it. I don't know what happened to it. But from then on, it's been so long. I don't think what happened after then.
Well, tell me about your husband in the funeral home. What happened to his funeral home? Your future husband.
They destroyed the funeral home down on, partially destroyed it. It was on Archer Street then. And Mr. McBurney had a funeral home, white. And he came down, he said, well, Jackson, if you get some bodies or something before you can get on your feet, just bring them over to my funeral home and we'll take care of them for you. And from then on, I don't know.
You did tell me in an early interview that McBurney and 2 or 3, McCune, and I think one other funeral home were ordered by the city to embalm the few black bodies that were embalmed. Since Jackson, who did most of the black embalming, his funeral home was destroyed, the city ordered these 2 or 3, McCune and McBurney, I know, and I think one other, ordered them, if they had a few bodies to be embalmed. Now, we do know the commission has found that most of the black bodies were buried in graves and speedily, Oak Lawn and Booker T, what is now, what used to be Booker T Cemetery way out on 91st. And there are rumors that some were just incinerated in the incinerator in Sand Springs.
I don't believe that.
And other rumors are that some were dumped in the Arkansas River. But we do know the bodies were decaying. It was urgent to get something done with the bodies so that there would not be an epidemic of disease. And I understand those 2 funeral homes that were embalming a few of the black bodies hired your husband and that he stayed at the funeral home. Didn't you tell me that he stayed there?
I don't think he stayed there. I really don't know where he stayed.
But he did embalm for those white funerals.
Yeah, McBurney is the only one I can remember at that time.
And I think you told me they paid him $25 per body. Or maybe I read that in the statistics or something.
Well, I don't know what they paid.
Okay. I have found that we have those records in our riot commission, and that your husband did do the embalming. In fact, I think the record shows that he actually stayed in the quarters behind the funeral home and embalmed for about 3 weeks straight, and that he got $25 per body. We do know that one of the bodies he embalmed was Dr. Jackson, this famous Dr. Jackson that was had trained at the Mayo Clinic and was shot by some ruffians, young teenage mobsters. Even after he had surrendered, they said he had come in from treating people and had his little satchel and was ordered to put his hands up, which he did, and he still was shot. Was taken to Convention Hall. I have interviewed some survivors who saw him there at Convention Hall lying wounded, and he died of his wounds, and your husband is the one who embalmed him. So we thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Well, thank you.
Steve?
Civil rights, King, Van Oker, roll 20, sound 36.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here into university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Now, of course, that particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted? I mean by that, there was a strong attachment on the part of your parishioners in Montgomery to the church. They were older people, weren't they?
Yes, I would say by and large they were older people who participated in the boycott because they were the ones using the bus more than anybody else. And Montgomery was a community predominantly church-centered, so that it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
Was there, in addition to your commitment to the idea of nonviolence, wasn't it also the only thing you could do, the white community having the monopoly on violence, that if you had tried violence, they would have met it with violence? It was the only device open to you, wasn't it?
Well, I'll put it another way, that morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that in our struggle in Montgomery and all over the United States for that matter, nonviolence is also practically sound. It would just be impractical for the Negro to turn to violence. He has neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence. We are about 10 or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower. So it would just be totally impractical and unwise and unrealistic for the Negro to think of violence. Well, I saw this in the beginning in Montgomery, but this wasn't the basic reason that I turned to nonviolence and that I believed in it as a philosophy. I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the Northern ghetto. I have the feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the northern ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Wherein in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. Consequently, this is made for despair and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win. And it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
Well, in the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains: Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier, because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they are coming to see them, because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they are coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger, and then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in 64 and even 65 of the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism, do you have any idea of what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here, because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality, and they are always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
Why are they looking for the excuse? What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here in chains, treated in very inhuman fashion, and this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Apart from wanting to live better, which all of us want to do, to raise one's children in a better way, to be better, does the Negro in America know what he wants to be?
I'm convinced that almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred by the system that they've become pathological in the process, and we all have to battle with pathology. Nobody really knows what it means to be a Negro unless one can really experience it. And I know we all have to battle with this constant drain of a feeling of nobodiness. But in spite of this, I think the vast majority of Negroes in this country know that they want to be people, they want to be men, they want equality, period. It just boils down to that. And we haven't been able to be people. We haven't been men because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that we want to be men. We want to be persons judged not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
But you know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks of the American white middle class. But do they want something that smacks of whatever is the black middle class, or do they just not want bourgeois values, which after all are the basis of this democracy?
Well, I think we have to see what they are saying. I would be the first to agree that integration does not mean giving up everything that has an Afro-American taint, so to speak, our background. I think there are certain unique things within any culture and certain cultural patterns that when you get to the process of amalgamation can really lift the whole culture. And it seems to me that integration at its best is the opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. I think the other thing that we've got to see is that these young people are saying that there must be a revolution of values in our country. As Jimmy Baldwin said on one occasion, what advantage is there in being integrated into a burning house? And I feel that there is a need for a revolution of values in America, because some of the values that presently exist are certainly out of line with the values and the idealistic structure that brought our nation into being. Unfortunately, we haven't been true to these ideals, and many of the values of so-called white middle-class society are values that need to be reviewed and re-evaluated, and in a real sense, they need to be changed. So I think the young people in the Negro community who are raising these questions are raising some very profound questions about our total society. In other words, they are saying that there must be a restructuring of the architecture of our society where values are concerned. And with this, I would agree with. So in the quest for integration, I think we can offer our whole nation something, because there are three evils in our nation. It's not only racism, but economic exploitation of poverty would be one, and then militarism. And I think in a sense, and in a very real sense, these three are tied inextricably together, and we aren't going to get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
When you stood on the Lincoln Memorial that day in August, 1963, and you said, "I had a dream," did that dream envision that you could see a war in Asia preventing the federal government doing for the Negroes, preventing the society doing for the Negroes that which you think had to be done?
No, I didn't envision that then. I must confess that that period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others all across the nation, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South. And in 1954, which was, 64, 1963, 9 years after the Supreme Court's decision to be in the March on Washington, meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments, and I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation.